Hi, thank you for tuning in to Tranquility Magazine podcast. My name is Jasmine Royce, and I have been the editor and also host for this podcast and magazine. And I appreciate you being here and taking the time to become part of our community. And I hope you enjoy our content. But I wanted to stop before my next interview to say thank you for those that are a first responder or a volunteer first responder. As some of you may know, Los Angeles was hit pretty hard by the fires that happened in Pacific Palisades and Altadena. If not for the first responders that showed up on the scene to help us in every way that you can think of, including the volunteers that made a kind gesture to support us as we dealt with a lot. And I know that this is not a rare thing, that Mother Nature has had its turn with each of us in every state. So my heart is big with gratitude and appreciation for those of us that have dealt with milestones like this. But I do want to give thanks for so many that have made this their career path, that are willing to stand the course and be the resources that we needed at times of trouble. So thank you for the firemen, the paramedics, the police officers, and all the volunteers within the community and without, for doing their honorable gesture to help us out. In this, I have chose this interview on purpose to help us all in every state that we live in when we have trying times that require some knowledge about medical understandings. So Sam Coffman is today's interview, and I hope you enjoy and learn some survival tactics from a Green Beret retired medical herbologist. Please enjoy. Please become a subscriber. We always appreciate building a bigger community with each and every one of you. Thank you for your time, and stay blessed, thankful, and have gratitude for each and every moment we're here.
What we find is when we start working with wilderness first aid, wilderness first responder, we have an entire program at our school called the Austere Medicine program that sort of picks up where WFR certification stops and says, hey, well, everything you've had to this point is, how do you get to higher care? How do you stabilize the patient? How do you make sure that they don't get any worse? How do you make sure you package them and get them to higher care? But then the question comes up, what if there is no higher care, either for a day or a week or a month or ever? Where you're talking about maybe putting on a backpack and hiking to PCT, that is a point where a way to start a fire, a way to create warmth, a way to be able to build shelter, a way to be able to purify your water. All of those things we talk about as maybe survival skills, quote unquote, are actually medical skills at that point. So when I was in the military, when I was in the special forces, I had sort of, of course, we carry about, 100 pounds or more on your back all the time. And about probably a third of that, at least, is my med kit, is my medical. And out of that, even back then, I was carrying herbs, right? What is your supply of water? You probably are not going to be able to carry enough water all the time on your back to last you more than a couple of days, especially if you're putting a lot of exertion out. So you need a way to be able to purify water, whether that's through heat, whether that's a UV pin, whether that's some sort of a chemical sterilization, or whether that is some form of a particulate filter like Sawyer or Life Straw and so forth. Called survival gardening, and it's sort of along the food side of what Herbal Medic is. So it's like, well, let's say again, disaster, and you had to live off of what you grow. How would the first 5 days, first 5 weeks, first 5 months, first 5 years look if you had to actually live off of what's in your garden?
Welcome to your journey to find true tranquility with the Tranquility Magazine podcast with your host, Jasmine Maya Royce. Today's episode featuring, you can find more information about Tranquility on our website, tranquilitymagazine.com.
Today I have Sam Coffman, MSAOM, LACRHAHG, W-EMT. He began his medical education in the U.S. Army as a Green Beret, Medica 18D in 1989. Over the years that followed, he dedicated himself to being able to work with botanical medicines as a successful method to provide sustainable healthcare in remote and post-disaster regions for chronic, acute, or physical trauma care. Since that time, Sam has taught herbalism for over 30 years and has worked as a clinical herbalist for over 15 years. His herbal and acupuncture clinic, Apothecary, are now located in Taos, New Mexico, along with his school. He has also founded Herbal Medics Academy, aka The Human Path. He is a critically acclaimed author of his book, The Herbal Medica, which we're excited to discuss today. Thank you very much, Sam, for being here.
Hi, Jasmine. Yeah, thanks for having me.
So my first question is always, what is your current mantra or your state of mind?
I would say it's pretty much the same that it has been for as long as I've been doing this, which is to find a way to leave the human condition better than I found it, or to do my part to try to do that at least.
Yeah, so you've done a lot of exploration into the herbal concepts. And where did it come up for you the first time you kind of went that direction?
Well, I mean, really, if I went back to the start of it, it would be my childhood. I grew up in a very plant literate family. We grew our winter food, usually most of our winter food in the summer, in the fall. My parents came from ranch, like wheat and pea farming, background. So growing food was a very normal thing for us to do, and canning, and of course, and all of that. And I remember even at the age of 4 or 5, my mother, because we as kids, we were all the labor for
Mhm.
that. And I remember my mom telling me that the plants that she talked to grew better than the ones that she didn't. And I remember talking to plants, at that age and being really curious about that. So really, I'm probably back that far, but certainly into the mid 80s is when I started to really be able to ask myself those questions. And I was kind of well, I would say in remote regions as much as I could for sort of I was teaching myself survival skills, wilderness survival skills, what we would call ancestral or primitive skills, and foraging. And of course, along with that, a big part of that was herbal medicine. And then at the time I came back into the military, my second time to be a special forces medic, an 18 Delta Green Beret medic, I was already very much into the idea of herbal medicine. So if, in fact, at that time I had to make a choice between attending a TCM, a traditional Chinese medicine school, and getting my MSAOM back then, which, at that time I was like in my mid 20s, or going back into the military a second time for me to go into medicine that way. And what really my intuition or my heart or whatever led me into just really being interested in knowing emergency medicine, remote medicine, working in the field, working in areas that were, how do we combine the worlds of herbal medicine, sustainable medicine, along with a good background and the fundamentals of everything, being able to handle anything. And that's really what a Green Beret medic is taught, or at least back then was taught, was, being able to be a healthcare provider in a
Mhm.
situation where you might not have a medical director anywhere within 1,000 miles or more. So in other words, you might be one day dealing with an out, this goes back to the Vietnam War era where a special forces team, 12-man team would go into an area and work with the locals that were a resistance group or whatever, maybe the Montagnards, for instance, and be able to, with a 12-man team, the idea was to be able to form a battalion-sized force. And out of that 12-man team, you had two in each specialty, four different specialties. And the medic was really kind of the backbone of being able to work with the people, hearts and
Mhm.
minds of the people. So you might be delivering a baby one day, and you might be working to deal with a broken bone the next day, and you might be dealing with some kind of a flu or infectious disease outbreak the next, whatever. You had to be able to do all of that. Plus, of course, be very well trained in combat medicine. So it's kind of like being a combat paramedic on one side and being a sort of meatball level nurse practitioner on the other, I would say. And so that approach to medicine always intrigued me, the generalist approach, being able to do a little bit of everything and maybe not being doing anything incredibly well.
Mhm.
You're not specializing in one thing, but being good at a lot of things. And combining that then with herbal medicine, with plant medicine, with botanical medicine was a really big piece of the puzzle for me. So I spent, yeah, like the last 30 years, I've spent really integrating those worlds. And in that time, TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, has also come back into it, but
Mhm.
later in the game. So in other words, I worked with Western concepts and Western pathophysiology and Western approaches to medicine, but using herbal medicine in that way. And then at one point, in my life, I was able to go back to school and get my Master of Science in Acupuncture and Herbal Medicine, my MSAOM, and that allowed me to get my license and all of that, and to practice and to work with traditional Chinese medicine, and even more than that, classical Chinese medicine as well.
Mhm.
Back before the advent of, the TCM, the revolution in China, and all the things that kind of changed with classical Chinese medicine then. But what I found in that process was that I think Chinese medicine gave me a vocabulary to work with
Mm.
plant medicine that did not exist in the Western world. Probably did at one time. It certainly did. We had Greek traditional medicine. We've had, of course, Ayurvedic medicine is
Mhm.
Indian, obviously not Western.
Mhm.
All kinds of different paradigms from different indigenous medicine roots, but from the perspective of pharmaceutical medicine, of allopathic care, it's a language that's set up to work with singular molecular compounds with pharmaceutical medicine in the way
Mhm.
that works. And it's not set up to work with a plant that has thousands and thousands of constituents in there that act differently in our body, and that our
Mhm.
bodies, species, have been interacting with for hundreds of thousands of years. So there really needs to be a language to describe that. And that's what TCM, I think, gave me after all of this of kind of creating my
Mhm.
own language. And I really didn't know it was my own. I didn't go and learn from anybody specifically. There's a lot of books that were kind of references for me in the beginning, but really a lot of what I learned was in the field and working with the medicine specifically, as though there was no other medicine available. And I've been in those situations many, many times. So
Mhm.
nothing was just a copy and paste, and I've had thousands and
Yeah.
thousands of patients or clients over the years. And so been able to kind of, rather than create that empirical database as well as what works and what doesn't. So then after doing that for so long and then coming to TCM, it was like somebody finally gave me a language to start explaining these things that I'd been trying to figure out on my own for so long, but we don't have a language for in the West. So
Mhm.
it's a wonderful addition, I think, to the layering of how to work with health in the human body.
Yeah, I think it's enlightening. There's a lot of aspects in there, what you're talking about. One, the merging of Eastern and Western traditions and understanding. When it comes to herbalism, the vocabulary can be varied, and sometimes different timelines has different words for things, and sometimes clarity helps you to define something. But when you're for your experience in the act of healing someone, you have to find what your treasure trove all around you already gives you, what environment you're in, what grows there, what can you use it for, how it helps the situation in an emergency concept. And that's what this book does amazing job as clarification in emergency situations. It's a great breathe through in a way that it's flip friendly. And I don't mean that as a disregard to every information, but you can specifically point out different areas that you can grasp the use and the utility of herbs as well as other things. I want you to start with the basics on the book, and I'll give you I'm a certified first aid, but I learned now they do first aid different. So if you do first aid certification, you do splint certification other than that. So you have to two separates where it used to be one, and now you have to do two different things. But you start up your book in first aid understanding. So if I was someone that knew basics and I was going on a hike, like a long distance one, say the PCT, and I was backpacking, what are some of the few elements that you would suggest a person to bring with them for emergency situations that are not herbal, just utilitarian?
Sure. This is a wonderful thought to have about things, because this what we find is when we start working with wilderness first aid, wilderness first responder, we have an entire program at our school called the Austere Medicine program that sort of picks up where WFR certification stops and says, hey, well, everything you've had to this point is how do you get to higher care? How do you stabilize the patient? How do you make sure that they don't get any worse? How do you make sure you package them and get them to higher care? But
Mhm.
then the question comes up, what if there is no higher care, either for a day or a week or a month or ever? What do you do
Mhm.
then? And in that process of asking that question, when I first started the school, well, the 2.0 version of the school really in Texas, where do we start? It's like that
Mhm.
old saying that if you really want to create an apple pie from scratch, you need to start by creating the universe, right? It's the
Mhm.
same idea. And so what you're asking there is at that point where you're talking about maybe putting on a backpack and hiking the PCT, that is a point where a way to start a fire, a way to create warmth, a way to be able to build shelter, a way to be able to purify your water. All of those things we talk about as maybe survival skills, quote unquote, are actually medical skills at that point, right? They're protecting us from hypothermia. They're making sure that we don't get some sort of an infectious disease passed through the water. They're making sure that we have the nutrients that we need to be able to continue. They're making sure that we have shelter and so forth. So those things are actually medical skills, right? And the same thing is true then as we get a little bit more into the medical side, the first aid side, as to what do we carry in a pack. So when I was in the military, when I was in the special forces, I had sort of, of course, we carry about, 100 pounds or more on your back all the time. And about probably a third of that, at least, is my med kit, is my medical. And out of that, even back then, I was carrying herbs, right? And it wasn't something that was condoned. My medical director didn't know about it, but all my teammates loved it because I was able to work with them. I was able to help. It started being, they were some of my first clients, honestly. Them and their family is like, well, hey, help us out with this or help us out with that. I started doing plant walks when we'd be on, on training, and we'd have a break or something for other medics. So anyway, but my point to that is that all of that gear is on my back. But what if you don't have your backpack? Then what? And so cargo pockets, so I had a cargo pocket survival kit in one cargo pocket, and I had a medic kit in the other, just a first aid kit in the other. And so what goes into those things? Well, from the survival standpoint, again, you need a way to be able to, start fire. You need to be, or have warmth. You have to have that thing, or to get dry. You have to be able to boil water. So all of those things mean that you need to be able to start some kind of a fire. You need to be able to create some sort of shelter, and it would help if you had some form of a knife or a tool to be able to cut and to chop and to do those things. It also helps if you have something to be able to tie things together. So sort of like the idea of hardware. If you go to the hardware store, there's tool sections where you buy things to be able to cut things up, and there's fasteners aisles where you learn to go buy stuff to be able to pull things together. And that's really the nature of the tools that you need to build. So paracord or 550 cord and some form of a knife is always on my belt anyway. Like I always carry around just basically a multi-tool, but any form, whether it's a fixed blade knife or whatever, is also very important there. Then beyond that, what is your supply of water? You probably are not going to be able to carry enough water all the time on your back to last you more than a couple of days, especially if you're putting a lot of exertion out. So you need a way to be able to purify water, whether that's through heat, whether that's a UV pin, whether that's some sort of a chemical sterilization, or whether that is some form of a particulate filter like Sawyer or LifeStraw and so forth. Those would be, and it's good to have more than one, right? It's good to have a backup as well. And maybe your plan B or even your plan C is always going to be to boil water, which means you need to have a way to start a fire and so forth. Okay, so that's sort of the survival piece. So, it covers with that shelter, it covers us with water, covers us with some form of being able to get warmth. Beyond that, though, in modern day and age too, a big survival piece that's totally changed since I was, in my 20s, is the idea of GPS coordination or coordinates and GPS tools and your apps on your phone, whether it's, AllTrails or Onyx or Gaia or whatever. But that means that power is now an issue. So we need to have a way to have backup power, battery, lightweight type of battery, or even a solar type of battery, something that we can make sure that we have power to be able to find our way out, unless you have, as a backup at least, some sort of a topo map and the ability to read a topo map. That's actually a skill as opposed to just something you can use. So that's also become kind of a new thing, since I started doing this. On the other side, on the medical side, on the first aid side, we need a way to be able to, of course, both sterilize or clean, not necessarily sterilize, but clean out any kind of wounds in the field and then patch them up. And that can be from the common stuff like blisters on our feet to just minor, boo-boos that we just want to keep clean and make sure that they don't get dirty in the field. And then some form of a way to be able to clean those out, whether it's through just an irrigation and it's just like some form of like irrigation syringe, and we're just using our drinking water for that, which is probably the easiest lightly way to do that, to even having maybe some betadine or something that we're able to use to mix to be able to at least clean the area around the wound off and so forth. Those are probably some of the most important things. So being able to have closures and pull skin together and so forth. But there are many other little things in there. So if you're hiking, one of the big you come into is things like chafing, just chafing in your thighs.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen in the military, I've seen guys end up with cellulitis and having to be shipped out to higher care after a week or so of not taking care of something like chafing, blisters as well, so most,
Yes.
certain types of tape, right? And then also, sprains and strains, like this is a skill thing, but as I show out in my book, there are some really good taping techniques that you
Yes.
can use literally to even on something like an ankle or a knee,
Mm-hmm.
especially which is a very common injury, to be able to stabilize it almost as an exoskeleton type support, even a severe, level 2 or type 2, or, a severe sprain of the ankle, and you can still limp or walk on it. That's another aspect to tape, different types of medical tape or A type. And that could be
Mm-hmm.
sports tape, or it could be leukotape, which is good for
Mm-hmm.
pretty much everything, or L
Yeah.
tape is. And then even just this doesn't take up any room hardly to just have a little bit of K tape there, your kinesiology tape, not for weight bearing structural injuries, but minor injuries that we need to be able to still move around. Those are really good, or for buddy splinting fingers together and that type of thing as well.
Yeah.
So, multi-use of anything that
Mm-hmm.
we have packs is really important. We want redundance, but we want redundance through something that we can use for a number of different things, preferably.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I really enjoyed your perspective because you enlightened me on a different concepts when I was reading the first aid elements. And, I always think to myself, because you were talking about being in a, hardware store. I personally love them, but it's like you mentioned something. I was like, yes, I do have that, but I didn't think about it in that way. Duct tape, which I call the force. It's like it has a light side and the dark side and holds the universe together. But as a utilitarian function, it's very useful. And also putting it in your kit, I didn't really think about it as well. But when you're talking about blisters, I was enlightened about the idea that you were talking about the mole rings. And I could have used that the other day. Like, okay, a brilliant idea of utilize something else or having them on hand to deal with a blister, because blisters can be bigger or smaller. And the puncture points that you talked about in the different regions of popping a blister would never be from the top, from the bottom, or the side, sorry. And I was like, oh, that's a different concept that I didn't think about before. So there was a lot of enlightening moments for that first aid element to kind of consider whatever I need to be more aware of extra elements to go wherever. And blisters and sprains are very much predominant when it comes to hiking. And I hike a lot by myself. So I always have to have some survival tactics in place just in case I'm out there by myself alone in somewhere that's not anywhere near anybody else. But it's important to kind of set it up to be okay after something like that happens for yourself. But in that factor, if you are coming across someone that you haven't met or haven't interacted with before, and you're in a situation and you don't know anything about them, how would you assess the situation for that?
And they're injured?
Yes, let's see that they're coughing and hacking, and it looks like they got sick, and you don't know how they got like that, but you found them like this.
Yeah. So there's the approach generally from the standpoint of wilderness first aid or wilderness first responder is sort of a 3-tier aspect. And the first tier is just safety, scene safety. So is the scene safe? Is there, in what you're describing, maybe a medical or even environmental issue and not necessarily trauma that was caused by something like a rock slide or whatever, something, or bear attack, or, so is the scene safe is still the first and primary thing we have to acknowledge. If we don't, we can become a subject ourselves and need medical attention. And so there's an old mnemonic that we use called the 4 Ps, personal safety, partners safety. In other words, if there's anybody on your team or working with you, public safety, then last, and in this order, the patient safety. So once you've taken care of that, then the next thing is to just do a quick assessment for what we call a primary survey, which is, are there any life threats going on here? Is there anything that we can see that would be a life threat? And that's generally the old ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation. And in addition to that, disability, D, and E, exposure. So disability meaning, is there kind of any level of consciousness change? In other words, do they appear that they might have an issue? Did they hit their head? Do they have a head injury of any sort? And then are they warm enough or cool enough? Is there any problem of hyper or hypo, higher or low temperature? Are they too hot or are they too cold? In other words, right? Once that's out of the way, then the next thing that we can do is we can get sort of a general idea as we're talking to them of a baseline of where they're at. And this is just from a level of consciousness. And so we talk about like an LOC or an A or alert and oriented, however you want to use it, different mnemonics for it. And that gives us a they say times four. Do they know who they are? Do they know where they are? Do they know when they are? And do they know what happened? And that's not something you necessarily have to ask those specific questions, but it's important to be able to put in the, to say, hey, as we're talking to them, taking a note of how their level of consciousness is and how they're responding to us, so that if that changes, we have a baseline to go from. Of course, breathing, the respirations and how fast they're breathing, how slow they're breathing are a part of that, as well as the idea that, or pulse as well, is it too rapid and so forth. So there's, the things that we check for that are kind of part of that baseline as we move ourselves into this idea of a secondary survey or a secondary assessment. What we're doing there is we are getting an idea from them as to what the history is behind why they're feeling. So when we talk about injuries, and I know this is a lot of information to kind of take from the level down, but it's important to know that and not focused in tunnel vision. So when we're talking about injuries in the field or illness, what we generally want to say is we can usually classify it into three ways. It can be a trauma-based issue. It can be a medical issue. In other words, somebody who has an ongoing medical problem, right? Or something. Maybe they suffered a stroke. Maybe they have a heart condition, so forth. And then environmental. And it just doesn't mean that they're mutually exclusive. It can certainly be, more than one. A person could be hypothermic and be really cold, or hyperthermic, let's say, and then they ended it exacerbates the heart condition they have, and they're trying to drive on a road out of the woods, and they run into a tree, and you literally could have all three happening there. But generally in this situation that you've described, is probably, a medical related situation. Maybe environmental, but you're describing a respiratory thing. So probably most likely that's going to be the first thing that we start to narrow down on. And in that regard, there's another mnemonic that we use for that I teach. And this is just wilderness first aid level. This isn't anything extravagant in terms of its complication. And that's mnemonic sample that we use. So what are their signs and symptoms? That's the S. A, do they have any allergies? And this can be used superficial level in a WFA, or it can even go much deeper in a clinic. You can, I still teach this in our clinical programs. So A, do they have any allergies? Is it any possible there's an allergy relation situation going on here, right? And there's signs and symptoms where, okay, yeah, I'm coughing a lot. I have a lot of flu. So you can go into detail on that. Do you have a lot of phlegm? What color is the phlegm? Do you have anything coming out your nose? How long has this been going on? Do you know anybody else who's had this problem as well? So, in other words, is there an infectious disease thing here? Yeah, it was a flu and they caught it from a family member before they come out, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
The M, medications. Are you on any medications? In that process, a lot of times you can find out, is there a pre-existing condition here, like asthma, for instance, or COPD? So, what kind of medications are they on, if they are on any? Of course, you can go into more depth on this, with things. What do they eat? What's their, literally anything that has to do with healthcare, from the nutraceutical and the supplement side, all the way over to pharmaceutical side and in between. So that's our M. P, previous illness or injury. Have you had this before? Has anybody else had this? What do you think it is? What do you feel like it is? And then L, the last, intake and output. So in other words, how much have you been drinking? How much are you peeing? How have you been eating? And how much are you pooping? And of course, as we get into that and digestive stuff, this can be much deeper in the clinical side, in terms of, constipation or loose stools, or any kind of blood in the urine or blood in the stool and mucus and so forth. So there's a lot more depth that could go into it, but just that's the general idea. And then E, the events leading up to, and so in other words, what kind of happened? When was the last time you weren't experiencing this, and before that, let's talk through that. So that's kind of how we go back on the history of that. And that usually gives us enough of an intake in the field to be able to deal with at least diagnosing or assessing what is happening there. And from there, then we can make our plan, or, if you're following the Western kind of allopathic SOAP, subjective, objective assessment and plan. So then we get to the P part of our SOAP note, which is, what is our plan? How are we going to deal with this? What's our protocol as such?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to understand who you're dealing with, what has happened before, medical related, non-medical related, the experience on the timeline, their entire personal, diagnostic. You would say, like, have you peed? Have you drank? How long has this been happening? What's your stool like? All of those elements can lead you in direction that you're talking about, knowing more specifically, but it's harder, I would say, for anyone. Are you like so skilled that you can, pinpoint something out of all that intake information because you're skilled in this department? So you would be able to be more fluid in your decision-making process. So if this person per se has a lot of medication, for asthma and stress, maybe related ones. So if they're taking that already and they're having a stomach problem, that they ate something along the path. Otherwise, their health sounds normal, average, but they went on a hike, they decided to pick up something and ate it. They don't know what it is, and they're throwing up. And you're throwing up whatever you ingested. So what would you kind of consider as a factor in that?
Sure. So as we get into something like that, if there's actually they ate something toxic, first would be trying to identify what they ate, if we could, if that's possible. Oh, I picked up a bunch of mushrooms and I still have some here. That would be a good idea, right? Secondly, figuring out how long it's been for them and what their symptoms have been. So if it's digestive, their body's trying to react to that, then we have, vomiting and we have diarrhea, possibly, anything along the gastrointestinal tract from one end to the other. What's been going on there? How about, is there any other, toxicity type symptoms going on, neurological, for instance, any dizziness, how about headaches, how about any kind of issues around outside of just the digestive symptoms or signs that they're talking about. And so that helps us at least, again, this is a wilderness first aid level thing, so that with somebody that we don't know, we're not going to jump into working with herbs. And in fact, before we even go there, part of the safety thing, I didn't get into this, but there's a whole aspect in terms of consent that goes in there too. We have to have consent before we start working with somebody we don't know. Now, that can be implied consent if they're completely unresponsive and lying on the ground, or it can be implied consent if it's a juvenile or an underage child and there's no parent or guardian around. Those things are implied consent, but otherwise, we have to have consent. So that's part of all of this as well, right? And then once we start working with somebody, really the whole idea of the Good Samaritan Act, and every state has their own version of this, but to protect us from a lawsuit is, we have to stay with them, or at least we have to be on the track the whole time, right? We can't just abandon them. No abandonment, right? And that means that if I start talking to this person and there's no way, they're so sick and they're vomiting, they can't go anywhere, but I can't carry them out, I need to go for help. I'm still on track. I haven't abandoned them, but I have to leave to get help back, right? That's what we're talking about there. And that we can't ask for any money for any treatment, any kind of compensation for that. And that as we're working with them, those are really important aspects, and that we don't do anything outside of our scope. So this is kind of what I meant by this tangent, is coming around to herbs, is, with somebody that I don't know, I'm not going to pull out herbs per se, but there is depending on what the toxin is, there's a very low risk application that we can use that I would feel safe with anybody, even a complete stranger, using in this situation, if they were having these symptoms that you're talking about. And it's not herbal, it's simply activated charcoal. I think that is, so let's say they're vomiting and or they're having really bad diarrhea. They said that as far as they know, it was from something they ate. Maybe they show me what that was that they ate, and I can say, yeah, that's a toxic plant. You shouldn't have eaten that. This is a substance that we can help with charcoal. Activated charcoal works for non-polar toxins. So it wouldn't work for something like alcohol poison. It wouldn't work for something like if somebody drank some Drano or something like that, that's very polar, acid or base, but it will work very well for non-polar toxins in our body. So we can eat that, and it binds then, it binds with these non-polar toxins that are in the body and helps us flush them out. It helps, with bad diarrhea. It'll help dry that up a little bit. They might even throw up right away, and that's okay. They can take it again. Everything's going to turn black that comes in there. Wherever it comes out, it's going to start looking black. And that's something I always carry in my first aid kit, always. So that would be something that would be a kind of a low risk, pharmaceutical, but it is technically all pharmaceutical. I mean, it's carried on the streets, your EMS, your paramedics and so forth, they're all going to be able to use it. Any ER, you're going to find it as well, and buy literally, not even in a drugstore, right? And it's not herb. So that way, worried about the aspect of the Good Samaritan Act. You give somebody a whole bunch of herbs and then they get sicker, and maybe they were going to get sicker anyway. But it's like, well, did they get sicker because you didn't know what you were doing and you gave them a bunch of herbs, or did they get sicker because they would have anyway? So I think it's really important to protect yourself that way too.
Yeah, it's important to be informative, and also consent that you're talking about, and understanding the situation and not leaving them for long, and don't have expectations about money, because those are clear understandings of moral integrity, so to speak. But in that article, I learned for a long time about utilization because I was like you at Fort Bragg and my ex got obscenely sick and we were dealing with the aftermath. You never want to travel being food poisoned and have to deal with that. So I had to probably go to the same store you went to when you mentioned in your book at Fort Bragg to get these charcoal pills because that was the only way that I could figure out how to get rid of cleansing his system because I thought it was important to get whatever was in out and faster that you wouldn't be sick for so long and a long road trip that we were on. So it's a very important thing to carry on you. I didn't have it at the time, but it is available some places. But I would say that it would be a great idea to have with you for emergencies like this, just because people do ingest things that don't. But in that, you were talking about a little bit on the idea of herbal and pharmaceutical and the pairing of them together. How would you assess someone that is coming to see you and was looking for herbal remedies for, say, their headache, and you're assessing how to deal with chronic headaches that are migraine related, and they're already on, they're not on any medication, but they can be. How are they, certain ones competing with each other? And what would you say that would be as much as a non-compete, so to speak?
Or when you say competing, you mean between pharmaceutical medicine and herbal medicine, or what? Yeah. So again, there's a couple different ways to be able to look at anything from the herbal standpoint, which is whether it's Western and kind of allopathic based or not, or TCM, or even any kind of energetic. I hate using the word energetic because it can be really woo, but when I say that, I mean the TCM kind of energetic language. So from the Western allopathic perspective, what I used to do with migraine stuff was I tried to figure out, is it more vasodilatory or more vasoconstrictive? In other words, if I ask them, does it help to, for instance, to put ice, does cold help does it, or does it exacerbate? And so that would be one of the hints I would have. And so there were herbs that I would use that would be a little more vasoconstrictive for vasodilatory type, so feverfew fits in there, for instance, ladies mantle fits in there. And so I work with herbs that are going to be more vasoconstrictive in that regard, and it can even be something that's, where you're talking about topical as well as sublingual and oral, can even affect a lot of migraine issues that aren't necessarily either of those two so much as more of an inflammatory response, perhaps. I had a patient so many years ago that had horrible viral meningitis and it turned into bacterial meningitis, and she'd been in the ICU for almost 9 months, I believe, if I remember correctly. That had been years before I saw her, years before, and she died. She coded twice, in the ICU. It was really bad.
Meningitis does that. Okay.
And so after that, she had these horrible migraines. She couldn't sleep. She'd wake up in the middle. It just was horrible. She'd been diagnosed with with so many different issues, so many different, trigeminal neuralgia and Bell's palsy and migraines that were from here and then migraines from there. But really my big question was, well, what are the docs that you've been going to said about your meningitis? And she's like, well, they don't think there's a relationship there. I was like, well, did you have them before that? No, not at all. It's like, well, clearly there's some trauma, some sort of inflammatory damage, some meninges, or to the nervous system here. And so how can we, and I think in all cases, a lot of times, many cases of migraines, we're going to find some neural damage there, some neural inflammatory process there that's out of control that we have to try to deal with from a Western perspective. And we can use herbs to do that as well. And we can use, my point in that being, I started out by saying sublingual and oral, but really you can do intranasal, you can do intraocular, you can do nebulized herbs as well, to be able to really get those herbs to the bloodstream and get them to the tissue that may be really the tissue that needs to get it, as opposed to just taking something orally, getting it into the bloodstream, assuming that the constituents you want even get into the bloodstream, go through first pass detox in the liver, and then get out to where they need to go. That's a long way around a lot of times for something like a migraine. So that's kind of been my Western approach. The ECM approach then, though, is to look at a lot of other aspects that I didn't used to look at, so heat that's related to any number of things. It can be related to some sort of constricted chi. It can be related to a deficiency heat that's ongoing, a chronic issue. It can be related to what's called phlegm. And by phlegm, there are different types of phlegm in TCM, and they don't really necessarily relate, some of them, to what we consider to be phlegm. But you can have an issue there. They can be issues around a different organ system, like starting from the liver to the heart and so forth. And so heat and versus cold becomes a big question here. Deficiency versus excess becomes a big question here. And as we do that, and we do a sort of a syndrome differentiation based on TCM principles, we find an entirely different approach where we're trying to balance out things that are imbalanced in a way that plants work. They actually work that way very well. And so I've been flabbergasted by the success of being able to layer in these, this language using TCM herbs, a lot of them for exactly what I was talking about. In fact, that one patient I mentioned was probably 12 or 13 years ago, was one of the first patients I ever used nausea oil, NASYA, like the Ayurvedic nausea oil, which is basically used oil that we put into the nose, like 2 or 3 drops into each nostril and rub it into the membrane there. And so I read a bunch of different research about some different herbs that have been used in some tests in India to deal with early onset dementia and, just cognitive loss and so forth. And that really set me on this rabbit hunt to be able to find some of these herbs. So I started using a lot of TCM herbs that were researched to be able to reduce myelin sheath inflammation and to repair myelin sheath, the neurons themselves, but the myelin sheath around the neurons is what we're looking at there. And that was incredibly successful. In fact, for this woman, it was probably the big transition for me because she was so affected in a positive way by that treatment. She literally called me within the week and was crying on the phone saying that she'd had her first time that she'd been able to sleep 8 hours in something like 10 years, So these things were like, okay, we're onto something here. But then, so my point is, you could take those TCM approaches and the syndrome differentiation from that perspective and come in and you would find, oh, wow, the West actually acknowledges this too, which just we have a different, kind of microscopic, reductionist way of looking at it, but this is why they work. And this is why a lot of the research, especially back then, was either Indian or Chinese, because they always started off with, we know this works. How does it work? And in American research is always, we don't think it works. And by the time we get done, we're going to conclusive evidence here. Is always constantly that, until the nutraceutical industry was able to take, is taking something and being able to turn it into money, which is basically pharmaceutical money. And I'm not here to bash the pharmaceutical industry, but there's clearly a profit motive around what nutraceuticals have made it, and the laws starting with the Deshay Act in 1995, how that's turned around the nutraceutical or the supplement industry, and how much of it is $1 trillion industry now, I think. So though, when you get to that point, then it's like, oh yeah, there's all kinds of buzzword marketing stuff. This has been shown to repair myelin sheath. I don't even think you see that yet, but we will, we'll see it.
Well, I understand. Like, I agree with you in different perspectives. So we're going to dial in a little bit so people understand. So when you're referring to TMC means the Chinese medicine, that's what you were talking about for your abbreviation, so people understand. Most of the time you're pulling from what my concept would be Ayurveda elements when you're talking about heat and cold, the body ingestion, like the mucus and all those are kind of a concept in Ayurvedic terms that are geared towards understanding, like if you're, you said it in a way, if your chi is off, or your pitta, a vata, or a kapha, and what ones you resonate towards, and how your body movement size and all your figure, you take those into place, into understanding what's going on in your inner working. But I want you to explain, because I know what meningitis is, because personally I've lost a few friends on this, but just explain a little bit briefly about what meningitis is for those who don't know what it is.
Sure. Well, the meninges is the surrounds our nervous system, our central nervous system, right? Our spine and our brain. And so to have inflammation, itis, the term itis as a suffix means inflammation. That inflammation can be caused by a number of different things. It can be caused by trauma. It can certainly be caused by different pathogens, whether viral or bacterial. And it's a very kind of sacred space. So you could think of it from physiologically in our body, where if you get pathogens in that space and you get an infection there, it can be absolutely life-threatening. It's a horrible situation, and it can cause damage. There's permanent damage to somebody. It can cause brain damage. It can cause, of course, death. So when you have any kind of an infection related to the meninges, it's a life-threatening situation, and you have to be able to deal with that. And that is a higher dire care situation, no
Yes.
doubt about it. That's IV antibiotics at the point it's antibacterial, antiviral, anything where we're doing that, if we get, whether it's swelling, whether it's, constriction or loss or any kind of ischemia going on, anything that's related to the damage that's going on there is going to be, again, something that has to be dealt with on this kind of very symptomatic Western emergency medicine level. And that's good. I mean, that's one thing that Western medicine does very well. I love that. I love emergency medicine. I think it's brought us so much, along with surgery, our surgery, especially orthopedic and even neurosurgery and certainly trauma surgery, anything that's related to that is fantastic. Cardiovascular surgery, all these things that have come to us from Western medicine that are fantastic. Those are tools that we need for something that's as severe as like bacterial meningitis, for instance.
I understand you, because for me, my experience with that, I lost 3 people when I was in high school. So very young, that you don't expect people like die that early until you're enlightened to the idea that it got to a point where they would shut down my entire school in my senior year if they had one more outbreak and one more death because of it. So that's why I'm familiar with it, but most people don't know what it is specifically. But in that, like, I agree with you immensely. When I moved back to the States, and the pharmaceutical company with the advertisements were very jarring for me, and the perspectives that I now think I have so many things that I have none of these things. But it's just that verbal dialogue that they use to ad friendly. It was a hard brace for me to understand why it was a plethora of people advertising for medical procedures that you don't even know or have. And the dialogue has happened. It changed, I think, in the 70s, like you mentioned, that they were now able to talk about these things on a public advertisement. And you are right that a lot of the advertisements come from sometimes herbal remedies that are doctrinated or altered in order for profitability. And that's the harder thing. So I mean, in your experience, I've seen a burst in herbology coming to surface for many people, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. Do you think that it's gotten a lot of traction recently just because of the use and utilities of herbal medicine?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first started into this back in the 80s, you had to be looking over your shoulder all the time. I worked even kind of part-time. I worked in this little mom and pop herb shop at one point, and I remember there was a woman who had taken chaparral, Luria, creosote bush, because she had liver cancer. Well, she was on chemo, and she had like stage 4 liver cancer. I mean, she was dying, but she kind of overdosed herself on chaparral, which is a very strong liver toxin as well. And
What
she
is
ended up dying.
Shrapara, so people know?
So it's creosote bush. It's Luria tridentata is usually the species. Anywhere you go in West Texas or South New Mexico, Southern Arizona, Southern California, on the desert side, on the east side, you're going to see miles and miles and miles of this. It's a bush that grows. It's got a yellow flower. It's got an incredible scent to it. It smells a little like creosote, but after a rain, when these flowers are blooming, it's really it's amazing medicinal plant. But it's also highly, it's toxic. It's medium to high toxicity. You have to be careful how you take it internally. In particular, it's a great wound healer too, by the way. But so she took a bunch of this internally, because has been researched for a long time as an anti-cancer herb, quote unquote. That means a lot of things. But so anyway, she died. There was this letter that came out. Remember the owners, and it literally was a husband and wife that owned it, and they were freaking out because they got this letter. It was an FDA letter that said, either take chaparral off your shelves or you will be taking it off, basic kind of letter. And that was the 80s. It was like one person, we have over 1 million people that die. That's the right person with the right drug, the right dosage that die in pharmaceutical drugs per year. But you get one person that dies from herb, and that's what happens, right? Back then.
Yeah.
Now, if you go all the way back to like 1910, the Flexner reports that were commissioned back then by whoever it was, the Rockefellers or the Carnegie, they were commissioned to pretty much rule out any other type of medical education in this country other than what became allopathic. So allopathic care had to be at a higher university that was accredited, in a medical institution and so forth. That's what they became. And that meant that only people of wealth and only people who were white and only people who were male were able to be doctors to begin with for decades. And back prior to that, allopath, a lot of times was where you went to die, like in the late 1800s. They were using arsenic and mercury. But back then, so this
Explain
kind
what
of
allopath is.
So this is what when we say MD, a medical doctor, right? allopath. If we say, so there are two branches that have been accepted as sort of the medical care, right? Allopathic care, an MD in the United States, and a DO or osteopathy. So a doctor of osteopathy is a DO. They both go through the exact same postgraduate medical education, with the exception the osteopathy schools generally are more holistic in their general mindset. They also have a section that's related to manipulative medicine, where they're moving, what we could call like a cross between chiropractic and massage, maybe deep to, so allopathy is pure MD. Now, the lines have become very blurred in the last 20. So because of the advent, among other things, the advent of functional medicine, which has been a way, it's not a specialty, a certified specialty, but it is, board certification that doctors that are MDs or DOs can get. Or, honestly, any healthcare licensed health practitioner, NPs can, PAs can as well, even RNs. I have one. To be able to use functional medicine is the idea of using, nutrients and really getting into the concept of what we're eating and what our lifestyle is, and acting accordingly, opposed to just, giving a prescription drug. And so that functional medicine, I think, has been a big part of expanding the world of what we would call allopathic care and osteopathy. Let's just call it mainstream medicine, expanding that out. And of course, in the process, on the periphery of that, we have all of our herbal medicine that's starting to get picked up a lot. So the flexion reports I was talking about, during that period of time, there was sort of a cloud of information or misinformation, as you will, over the next several decades, until sort of a resurgence of interest in herbal medicine in the 60s. And then up to that point, herbal medicine was just completely deemed as complete garbage, and none of it would work. It's just, it's people who are trying to take your money, even though we have a number of our original earlier pharmaceuticals that came from a lot of the constituents that we get out of plants, right? Metformin, for instance, from Galliga officinalis, right? And fast forward.
Metformin is a use for diabetes, so people know.
Correct, yeah, blood sugar, yeah. So fast forward to the 60s, 70s, the kind of the resurgence of herbalism became sort of this sort of woo emergence, right? Came this time when nobody really knew what was happening yet, but it was like, well, this herb makes me feel this way, so I'm going to say this. And of course, there's a lot of information that was lost. It was actually real information going back to the previous century, and herbalists, different branches of herbalism that happened both in the West and so forth. Well, coming back around now to this, there was a period of time where herbalism, and by this I mean American herbalism, kind of crawled on its hands and knees to become medical herbalism and get some sort of validation from the allopathic, the mainstream world. And along with that, then, like I mentioned, the DSHEA Act, the nutraceutical companies were able to kind of put a leash on the FDA to some extent, with a payoff later, with the CGMP coming out in about a decade later off of that. But be able to say, hey, this is money. I mean, this is big money. Nutraceuticals, this is now out in the population. Everybody, your common grocery store in aisle 13, you're going to be able to find herbs, right? So it's out there, and now it's money. And so now there's a whole different sort of cultural perspective, I think, on herbal medicine. And we're coming kind of back to that. And the threat, I think, of FDA, basically, pushing us back into the caves on this is pretty low, if not completely gone, because of the fact that the corporations that make money on this are too big now, and they're able to lobby and able to change laws and so forth. And that's both good and bad. I mean, it's it's the flip side of the coin. The good side of the coin is that it's a lot safer to practice an herbalist. And I'm a licensed herbalist, technically, since I have a license in acupuncture and herbal. And depending on the state I practice in and my license, I can work with herbs as a licensed practitioner. But there is no licensing whatsoever for Western herbalism. There is the registered herbalist sort of certification that you can get from the American Herbalist Guild, which is, it's peer reviewed. I've been a member of AHG off and on since the 90s, and it's
Explain what HD is.
It's the American Herbalist Guild.
Thank you.
Okay, it is an organization to promote the use and the acceptance of Western herbs and Western herbalism, really, in America specifically. It's open, obviously, to other things as well, the TCM and so forth, basically what it's there for. And they have a designation called registered herbalist, which is a peer review, send in a thing. I'm a registered herbalist. I did this, I don't know. But it's, kind of a cool thing. It's nice, but it's not licensing. It doesn't have anything to do with licensing. Yeah. It does not make you licensed to practice in your state. Now, depending on the state you live in, that may not be any problem at all. There are some states where it's really an issue, and there's other states that have, there's a couple different national lobbying agencies trying to really push for freedom of healthcare in that regard. And there's many states that have jumped on that board. So if you're in, California or Idaho or Colorado or New Mexico, and many other states, it's not going to be an issue because we have the freedom to search out. But there are some states, Texas, and being in Texas, I had to look over my shoulder there all the time. I had people always trying to entrap me in phone calls, asking me for cures for cancer. They were working for the state. They would call up with ridiculous lines, it was so obvious, coming into my clinic and looking at all my paperwork, and I had a way to be able to protect myself with that paperwork, and nobody ever really bothered me. But they're there, and there's states where that is really a problem.
Yeah, I mean, understand state liability, and also the concept that certifications, I'm certified as an herbalist, but it's very much a basic certification. I know the understanding of the basics, and I came from a hippie family that my father is a horticulturist. So we have had herbs around, and it comes from an ancestral background that most of my family has operated in that way. But sometimes clarity is helpful for people to understand what they're dealing with, to explore. And you have a great resources in here for specifically, we're going to talk about a couple, because I want you to touch on a few things, because I've seen them pop up specifically more on TikTok than I've seen before, and your viewpoint on it. We're going to talk about some feminine herbs. One, I want you to enlighten people about, you have a whole chapter on emergency birthing, but you also talk about herbs and remedies for postpartum and dealing with, not postpartum, but you say trauma after birth and bathing. Can you enlighten people about a couple of herbs that you recommend and why?
Sure. So just to give credit where credit's due, that chapter was written by Katia Limon, and it should state that in the book. It does. So we have 5 different programs at our school, Herbal Medics Academy, and one of those is the family program. And that included in that, as part of that program, if you want to do it, is doula certification. And it's an excellent doula certification. It's just twice as many hours as you get from the Doula Association here in the United States, DONA. She's amazing, and she's a midwife and an herbalist, and she has a master's in health as well. But she has created that curriculum and runs that program. So I asked her to write that chapter. So in that regard, she knows far more. She has far more experience. She's had thousands and thousands of patients over the years, many in remote areas. She lives in Mexico now, in kind of remote area. With that in mind, yes, absolutely, there are many herbs, and not just for postpartum trauma, but any kind of skin trauma, certainly, that are very useful to us. Any herb that's generally fairly astringent is going to be useful.
Explain a little bit about astringent before you go further.
So, all right. So when we have an herb so astringents generally herbs that pull, you can think of it as the reaction that you get when you eat a lemon, when you take a bite out of a lemon, what do your lips do? Everything just I know that's sour, but that's the idea at a cellular level, what happens in your body with an astringent herb. So what we're going to get is we're going to get hemostasis, or we're going to get, it's going to help stop bleeding. We're going to tighten up tissue, and it's going to generally helps move. Most of the herbs that are astringent also, in my opinion, help speed up the inflammatory process of wound healing. So wound healing, when we have wound heal, there's a few different ways to look at it. One of them is that there's 4 stages, and the first stage is hemostasis, or stopping the bleeding. The second is inflammation. Inflammation is where our body tries to repair and to get rid of all the garbage and all the junk there, whether through the lymph system or the blood or the circulatory system. And that astringent herbs like yarrow, for instance, is a great one for this, right? Partridge berry is a pretty good one. Uva ursi, or bearberry, is a great one. They tend to, in my opinion, speed up that inflammatory process so that we can move into the third stage, which is proliferation of that wound tissue healing. And those are herbs that we use, like comfrey or plantain or proliferative herbs. Chaparral, that I mentioned earlier, great proliferative herb. So we kind of can use herbs to help move our body through that. And our body knows what to use. So if you're doing a sitz bath, for instance, in postpartum care, your body, and you put some of these herbs that I've just mentioned into a decoction, or in other words, you've put them on a pot of water on the stove, and you've simmered it for about an hour or even just 30 minutes, and you've strained it, and now you pour that into your sitz bath and make sure it's obviously the right temperature, and you sit in there. You can dilute it, obviously, or whatever you need to do for the temperature. And now you sit in that, your body is going to use what it needs to use. And what it doesn't use, it's going to either metabolize, or it's just not. From an external wound standpoint, it's, in a sitz bath, it's no big deal. It's going to be right there and can be back into the water. An example of this was when I was also at the very beginning, and one of the first herbs I knew was chaparral, and I
Mhm.
knew it to be a wound healer. And I cut myself really badly. This was maybe would have been like 1990 or 91, somewhere in there. And I was using a wood saw, not even a lumber saw, but like a
Mhm.
for rough wood. So it had rough teeth that were different sizes
Yeah.
and shape. And so I cut myself along the thumb as I was cutting this log, and it was a nasty cut. It wasn't just a straight laceration.
Mhm.
And I cleaned it out real well. And then I had some powdered chaparral, and I thought, this is supposed to work. Let's just try it and see. And I remember I packed that wound with the powdered chaparral, of course, stopped the bleeding. And then
Mhm.
I taped. I didn't even have medical tape. I just used some electrical tape, I remember. And then I went to bed and I thought, well, I'll either be in the ER tomorrow or we'll see what happens. So the next day, and my point to this is the
Mhm.
idea of metabolizing herbs and then rejecting the ones that aren't needed. I
Yeah.
pulled that tape off very carefully, and I had this big chaparral scab on the outside of that wound, right? It was just
Wow.
like everything the body had used, and then everything it didn't. It was just a big scab, and it pushed it out. And so I really carefully, I got a little bit wet, and I carefully removed it. And the two edges of the wound all around, and it was like a jagged wound. It was, oh my God, it was like a plastic surgeon had bound them. And of course, I had to be really careful. I mean, it was easy to break that apart. You don't even hardly have a scar there, which is amazing.
Wow.
Healed it really quickly. Chaparral is also very anti-infective, which makes it a good choice in there as well. Uva ursi, as I mentioned before, also very anti-infective. A whole nother conversation, but it's good when you're working with external wounds to also have some herbs in there that are somewhat anti-infective.
I mean, infection is a very high scale of dealing with something like that in your body. And then a surprising tactic when you're discovering the utilization of herbs and how your body reacted or embraced it to healing faster than you would assume that it would be. So in the birthing pother so explain why that word is chosen for sitz bath and what it means. So
Oh,
people,
sure. So sits really, I don't know. It probably comes from the German sitzen, which means to sit.
okay,
I'm
and you
sure
do
that's where it comes
talking
from.
about it in your book and kind of the remedies to basically the bathing factor to deal with afterbirth and not the afterbirth, but after the birth and how to kind of to your body kind of healing and being back to normal, so to speak, in your body's physical elements. But in that,
Right.
you mentioned a couple of things. We're going to talk about another one that I want you to discuss. I live in California, so a lot of people that I interact with are avid swimmers and ocean dwellers and people that love surfing. And when it comes to someone that has swimmer's ear, what would you recommend for that?
So swimmer's ear is otitis externa. It's on the outside. It's this part of our ear outside. It's easier to deal with because the tissue that's infected is right there, right?
Mhm.
So first of all, just good cleanliness, and even after you're swimming, get done with swimming, just like my brother was a championship swimmer through high school as well as state champion, and his secret that the swim team, because this is a long time ago, but it was always just take some isopropyl alcohol on a Q-tip and just make sure you clean everything out so it evaporates and dries. So you really make sure you're clean. Once you have it, though, the good news is that if you have a bacterial infection on the ear, it's exposed and you can at least get to that. So depending on whether there's an opening or not, and there's probably not going to be one, here's where, from the herbal standpoint, we have to do the idea of either poulticing or plastering in order to be able to get that tissue, that herb to the tissue. Same thing as sitz bath, right? Because
Mhm.
with the sitz bath, that's what we're doing is just we're exposing that tissue. And by the way, that doesn't have to just be, vaginal. That could be rectal as well for somebody with hemorrhoids. There's a lot of reasons you could want to soak because you're
Mhm.
getting the herb directly to tissue. Same thing's true here, but it's probably not convenient. Put your head in a pot of water and soak it, right? So it's easier to put that to your ear. Of course, it's probably unsightly, but to have a poultice on there would be useful. We can also just rinse with a strong tincture of a lot of the anti-infective and in particular antibacterial herbs. A lot of times if we've had an infection that's been going on for a few days, we want what we call biofilm inhibiting herbs as well to be in that mix. Herbs that are like Baikal skullcap, or again, Uva ursi, bearberry is a great one for that as well. These are a couple of herbs that can go along with our anti-infective herbs. And these could include herbs that contain berberine. In
Mhm.
other words, like golden seal, or I don't use golden seal; it's at risk. But obviously Chinese coptis or any of our barberries in the U.S., Algarita, which is Berberis trifoliata, or just the Berberis vulgaris, the common bearberry that grows everywhere. There's a lot of barberries all over the U.S. that we can
Mhm.
use, and the roots have that yellow color, that's the berberine, right? That's an alkaloid, it's yellow, and it's very water soluble. So it's easy to use topically along with other herbs in a formula. I don't use it by itself, but with other herbs in a formula, it's very powerful. Oregon grape or Mahonia species is another one of those. And along with that, if it's an infection that's, say, staph or MRSA, the Oregon grape leaf is a really good component to have in there as well. So you can do this and create the idea of like, think of taking like a bag of tea that you've, put hot water on and soaking it on top of that. That's what we're basically going for there. So we clean the ear really well. And then if we're going to use an herbal topical, that's what we would do. I would prefer that to something like a salve or an oil. It's just a water-based is usually better for infectious stuff going on. And it helps usually we get transdermal absorption really well in that as well. Or alternatively, possibly an isopropyl alcohol liniment where we have infused those herbs into a liniment. So we make a lot of liniments that are really good for this kind of thing too.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to understand different variations on how to utilize the herbs, and they have different elements that you can buy or make yourself. I love that you've talked about Oregon grape because I was just in Oregon. That's where my dad is with my stepmother, and we were eating them because they were, in season, but it was not an herb that I considered being part of your collection. And because in herbology, you have different elements that you would use a plant for. So root-based stems and leaves have different reasoning sometimes that you use it for different concepts and different function. But in that, you were talking about the Oregon grape a couple times, and I enjoyed that factor because I was just up eating them because they're wild and they do grow in Oregon.
They taste amazing. Yeah, I love them.
They're delicious. So I was like, oh, wow, I've never had that. But also, Oregon's got into the grape growing for wine, but that was the natural one that was already available, and they grow it at their property. So we have a plethora of that. So I'm going to ask about flu and cold. So a couple recommendations for flus and colds, some recommendations for herbs in that department.
Sure. And that's something that's fairly well known by most people. The ones that are common that everybody knows, there's kind of a trifecta, and that would be yarrow and boneset and elder. Everybody kind of thinks about those three, and those are very commonly known. So those are good ones because they're easy to remember. Berry of elder is what most people are familiar with, but really the elder flower is what I prefer to use for this particular. Or what I really do is I make a half and half with berry and flower. And I have a whole process of medicine making for our own apothecary and our own store that I use for that, where I soak in apple cider vinegar first, and then after that I add in some other different both heat and other solvents, alcohol, water, and honey and glycerin in different proportions and in different temperature, and move through this to where when we get done we have a really incredibly strong extract that tastes delicious as well. It's elderflower and elderberry, but that mixed with boneset, which is our Eupatorium perfoliatum as well. The leaf is what we use of that plant, and then mixed with yarrow. Those three are really good. I mean, there are literally hundreds of cold and flu herbs we could talk about, very common, and they work really well.
Okay. For my tutelage, I was inquisitive that I just recently was acquainted with something you call devil's claw. It has its own section in your book. Can you explain a little bit about what devil's claw is and what it's used for?
Sure. So devil's claw, and I think it originally is more grown in Africa, but it's Harpagophytum procumbens. This is a plant that I use primarily, more than anything, I would say, for musculoskeletal inflammation, whether topical or internal. There's a really good TCM, I would say, kind of counterpart to it, which is our Acherantes bidentatis, called Oxney, one of the names. So these two herbs, in my opinion, work fairly similarly in terms of things like joint pain, musculoskeletal pain, great for sprains and strains as a salve or as a poultice or as a liniment. Truly a fantastic herb in that way. So really, and you could think of it as like, from a Western perspective, a quote unquote anti-inflammatory. But again, I don't think that it's really an anti-inflammatory. I think it's a pro-inflammatory. It shortens healing time because it increases the inflammatory process in a very gentle way and allows us to move from inflammation into proliferation faster from injury.
Yeah. What do you think about arthritis and osteoporosis in using devil's claw?
Sure. So there's, whether we're talking about osteoarthritis, we're talking about rheumatoid arthritis, the inflammation is going to be there. And we can absolutely affect some change in that regard with this herb as well. That's true. Yeah.
Okay. And right now, because TikTok has been blasting a lot of things about wild yam cream and the idea of wild yam cream as a reason and a source for menopausal, like when women are dealing with menopausal, and you also paired it with the devil's claw at one point. So can you explain about your viewpoint on menopausal use for yam cream or yam or you say wild yam.
Yeah, so of course, there's a lot of research that shows both progesterone and estrogen creams are very effective, no doubt about that. But when we come down to the plant constituents of wild yam, to be honest, I use wild yam more from a Western perspective. I use it more for inflammation, whether it's musculoskeletal or gut. It's great for gut inflammation as well. So I put it into a lot of different gut formulas where that's the case. When we're talking about perimenopausal issues and syndromes and endocrine disruption or just endocrine imbalances that start to happen with age, I got to tell you, I played for years. I played whack-a-mole with herbs on hormones, and it's just not effective. So, as we get these perimenopausal syndromes coming along, well, like stress and maybe even hypertension, and so cortisol levels, blood sugar levels, and issues with insulin starting to come about. The thyroid starts to jump in and say, "Well, I'll help," and you get all of this different sort of imbalances going on between different endocrine organs. Again, the Western approach is just with herbs is just kind of plain whack-a-mole. You go after this particular hormone, and then this one acts up, and blah blah blah. And I've never had a lot of luck with that, and I think it's silly. But when I got into TCM, a traditional Chinese medicine approach, everything just like completely changed. Completely. I was blown away by when I did my first clinical, trimester at the school I was at. I was working. My teacher was this very traditional from mainland China. She'd like 40 years of experience as an acupuncturist in China and was teaching. And we had this patient come in that was exactly that. And I had those in my clinic all the time. They said, it's an epidemic, right? Perimenopausal syndrome in America, I think, because of, not saying that it's not a sickness, it's just aging. It's a normal process that our bodies go through, but the way that we've treated it in the West, and because of toxins, because of the food we eat and the bad food we eat, and because of lifestyle and so forth, it's kind of become this epidemic. And this same thing, you see the same thing over and over and over again of these things I just talked about. Late weight loss, you just can't get rid of weight no matter what you do, and blood sugar issues and so forth, and cortisol. And anyway, Dr. Tan, I remember, she said, she just, she didn't have much of a bedside manner, to be honest, but asked some questions, and I was like, oh, this is, typical. I want to see what she does here, because I know what I'd be doing from a Western perspective. And she's like, okay, and then pulse and tongue, and then she's like, okay, yeah, let's do this, and then gave her a bunch of herbs, and I was like, Dr. Tan, is that like, was that difficult? Because she acted like it was so easy. She's like, oh, this is a low-hanging fruit. And I was like, this isn't low-hanging fruit at all. This is difficult stuff, man. But then I learned, from her, and then going forward, working and we're doing a lot of reading, a lot of research, and taking other, classes and conferences even, and so forth, that, this is like this approach of working with things like, kidney yin deficiency and even sometimes yang deficiency and liver blood deficiency, and things that we classify more from a TCM as we go into it, and being able to nourish those deficiencies and work with those. Oh my gosh, it was a whole new world. It's like suddenly, and I'm working with a functional medicine doctor, right? We have 2 MDs on our faculty at our Herbal Medics Academy, and one of them a functional medicine doc I've worked with for years, and being able to see numbers change, even somebody who works for us going through this and seeing these numbers just like totally change in a matter of weeks or months. It's like the proof is there. This is the way to approach this, because again, this is really a much closer language of how plants actually work and function in our body than using this idea of chasing after hormones with wild yam and I'm not trying to disparage that, but it's like wild yam's a cure-all for low estrogen. No, it's not. I'm sorry, but it's not. And I've seen a lot of those ads too. And to be honest, there's a lot of marketing buzzword stuff going on in there, in my opinion. Not saying that it won't help at all, and there is definitely something to be seen there, but to take one constituent out of thousands and thousands of constituents in that plant and say, well, this is the cure for this, it's just basically, it's worse than substituting a pharmaceutical on the same level, because you don't even have that. With the pharmaceutical, at least it's a single molecule, compound, and there's been who knows how many millions of dollars in research and figuring out how to get that molecule where it needs to go in the body. But with a plant, we don't even have that. It's just one out of thousands of constituents that we're saying works this way. And I'm not saying that it doesn't, it can, but it is not the right way really to approach something as complex as an endocrine issue.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate what you're saying because there's a lot in your explanation because I understand that, a cure-all or a solve-all in the way that the vocabulary has resonated towards pitching yam cream. And I know it's a good resource, but it's not the end-all cure-all for everything. But the ignorance that you're also explaining about menopause and how menopause is approached in our society is very shunned and quiet and in the darker side of humanity that we don't discuss it. It's the unknown department, and women are ignorant to the concepts of investigating and understanding their own body and what they need. And you can't, pharmacy cures are out there, but it's like your body is your own. So figuring out what you need and what you require on different elements of evolving and changing is part of this, and understanding how it will help in the herbal format, or also understanding what you need and what works for you is an individual stance. But I understand the clarity has been more out there because most women will buy anything that they say will solve a problem that they're dealing with. And that's why I wanted some clarity for that for other people. Just because you have the background in it does not mean that it doesn't have effective treatment, but it's just not the end all for that specific thing that are making it seem like you buy that and you won't have menopause anymore. I don't think
Yeah,
that's really going to be the truth of it, but that's my interpretation.
it's not. Truly, it's not. Yeah.
So I always ask the last two questions. What was the best advice you've ever received?
That's a tough one, but the only thing that pops into mind that I remember that sticks in my head was when I was in Special Forces Medic School at the very beginning of it. And at that time, it was called the 300F1. It was the first half of the medic portion of the Special Forces qualification course, SFQC. So we get there, San Antonio back then. It was in Fort Sam. That's where I met my wife at that time. And I remember the guy that was in charge, he was a major. And I remember him giving us this little speech to our class saying, once you get into medicine, you're going to jump and you're going to hit the ground and you're going to hit the ground running. You're never going to look back. And I thought, that really kind of applied to me because that's really what medicine has been for me. Medicine is a never ending, landscape of unknowns that you're never going to get through in your whole life. You could spend your whole life in just one little area and still not ever get through it. So for me, it's always been, just this amazing kind of landscape to be able to explore and to allow my intuition, to guide me. And I think in plant medicine, you have to allow your intuition to guide you and what you want and what you're doing. So that's been a big part of it too. So I would say that advice seemed to stick with me.
Amazing. I mean, it's important to understand like people that are geared you in a direction, and you have a multitude of certification in different departments and all culminating into a concept of healing, and that idea and understanding that, it is a prime source of your quest and also your value to society and how you help and elevate all of us to educate us about what we have at hand. And the last question, what is the best consideration from the hardest moment that you've ever experienced, and what were your prime takeaways from an experience like that?
Well, you were asking it from the standpoint, I think, of like what we would call failures and so forth. And I think one of the toughest times for me was I got into medical school when I was 42. I went back to school to do that. I went back and get, because I had an undergrad degree but it was a linguistics degree. It was like 100% liberal arts, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just I clep tested out of every possible, math or science class back then. I didn't care about that. My original love was languages, and I went in the military the first time, and I was a translator and so forth. And then I decided, I'd kind of given up on the school idea because the first time around for me, I didn't have the resources or the knowledge yet to do it. It was kind of early. The 1.0 version was in Colorado. Mm-hmm. And I was even still in the military at that time. Fast forward, and my kids were getting old enough that I could, look at maybe doing something that I wanted to do next. And I decided to go back to school and get through, all the pre-med, and got the MCAT. And I got into a bunch of different med schools. But the one that I got into was where we wanted to move back to San Antonio so that my wife could be close to her mother who was aging. And mm-hmm. so I got in there, and we headed down there. And then everything kind of fell apart financially for us in a way that was, enough it came down to me choosing for me or for my daughter, who was 13 at the time, who mm-hmm. rode horses since she was 6. And now that's what she does for a living. She jumps horses, trains horses and so forth, and competes. And it's fantastic. And so if that costs money. And so it came down to either walking away from med school, or staying there and like having to move into a, like a not being able to give her what she needed. And so
Mhm.
I walked away from med school. I mean, they kept it open for me for a couple of years, but I walked away from med school, and that was one of the hardest
Mhm.
things I think I had done up to that point in my life, because I worked so hard I
Yeah.
mean, I had a full-time job and going to school nights, and man, I worked hard to get into med school, and to walk away from it was just this confusion. It was like, what am I supposed to be doing? Well,
Mhm.
after I walked away from med school, within about 3 months, this 50-acre property that became our campus kind of dropped in my lap. I had started giving free classes in our backyard. We lived on a couple of acres in the hill country, and it was just going crazy. And it's like, oh, I'm ready now to start the school. It's been 15 years later. I wasn't ready the first time. This is our 2.0 version, and it's now I'm ready. And that was the school. From then on, it was just like, again, hit the ground running and never look back. So it was a difficult thing to do. But I mean, I wept like a child crying, driving away from, I knew I was never going to go back, driving away. And I was just like, man,
Yeah.
but then, it was like, that was the transition to close that door in order for another one to open.
Yeah, it's a hard loss when you've been planning a certain direction. And in my experience, men are linear. You have a prime direction, you have a prime outlet, you're on a goal, you have it all kind of planned out in your mind, and then life will throw you a twist. And I've seen a plethora of gentlemen kind of sacrifice their own wants and needs for the betterment of their family, your child as an example. But in that, you had a prime opportunities not to be afraid of the unknown, because some things will come into place when you give up on a method that you were so clear on before, that opportunities will arise and confront you. And now you have an amazing place that it's called Academy, and it is based in New Mexico, and also your resource on an amazing book. I have to tell you, if you are anyone that is looking for camping skills or survival and just understanding in California, we're always about earthquake ready. So this is a good companion to understand what you need to have a resource in your house and every element that you can be ready for at any situation, and a plethora of flip through moments to understand herbal remedies and how they're used for any element that you can think of. So it's very much a dictionary on everything you could imagine under the sun, but I highly recommend it. It's so good. And also you have a book coming in the future. Are you going to mention about that before we go?
Yeah, coming out actually two more from Story Publishing, from the same publisher that Herbal Medic. It's called Survival Gardening, and it's sort of along the food side of what Herbal Medic is. So it's like, well, let's say again, disaster, and you had to live off of what you grow. How would the first 5 days, first 5 weeks, first 5 months, first 5 years look if you had to actually live off of what's in your garden? This can even include insects. It's not just food, but also all the plants that grow that we consider weeds, quote unquote. And of course we know from an herbal perspective, some of those are their best medicine. But what about foods? How much of those weeds that are growing in our garden are perhaps edible as well? And how can we use those? And then how do we actually grow the food using very, very sound, soil restoration and permaculture type of approaches? But again, from the standpoint of actually getting yield, that's something we can live off of. How do we do that? What's got a lot of protein in it? What doesn't? How can we choose that? So that's called Survival Gardening. And then I have a third one that'll come out in about a year, I think. And it's basically all about water, everything you need to know about water. Again, pulling it out of the ground, pumping it, purifying it, taking it off of rainwater, even some herbal stuff in there for waterborne diseases. And again, situation is we don't have any water available. How are we going to go about dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, there are amazing resources coming out soon, and I'm excited for it because I'm in love with your book already. So, I will be the next reader for this. But you can check all of his elements in the bio and check out his website as well for anything from his apothecary to his classes. I hope you enjoy it all, and thank you very much, Sam, for your time today.
Yes, thanks for having me, Jasmine. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for tuning in to the Tranquility Magazine podcast. Please subscribe and add your questions to our Q&A. We want to give a thank you to our team for their effort in creating every episode and our content at tranquilitymagazine.com.